First of all, my name is Joris van Bladel. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow of the Egmont Institute. It's a privilege to be here, and I thank the organizers for having me, and I guess I can talk from the panel. A privilege and to be here, actually. First of all, welcome to you all. It's fantastic to see that there are so many students here. It's very good to see that students are interested in this topic, because actually we are going to talk about a very specific topic. This is the China-Russian relations, specifically in the region, the Arctic region. And we know we can read a lot about Russian-Chinese relations, clearly, but not that specifically on the Arctic region. And I think it's very important that we have a look at it. We will not come with a doom narrative. The purpose, I think, is to see the challenges, but also the opportunities. And I think this is important to underline. General, I think you agree with me. Those who kick off the operation are the elite forces, isn't it? So I'm very, very happy to present the panelists. This is, first of all, in the order of speaking, Balkan Devlin. He is a senior fellow at the Macdonald Laurier Institute, Canada. Then we have retired Brigadier General Robbie Boyd. He is an associate fellow of RUSI. This is the Royal United Services Institute in London. Then we have Jonathan Berkshire Miller. He is a senior fellow and the director of the Foreign Affairs, National Defense and National Security at the same institute as Balkan. This is the Macdonald Laurier Institute. And finally, and foremost, we have Elizabeth Bauer. She's a policy analyst, and everybody living in this region know Elizabeth. She's a member of the board of the Women in the International Security, Germany. The plan is, because time is ticking, and I have here, my role is to check time. The plan is the following. We are going to invite the speakers for a very short introduction, a couple of thoughts about the issue. And then, because I had the privilege this morning to sit in the breakfast and hear the discussion going on. And I found it very, very interesting, the interaction between these specialists. And therefore, I have decided to allow for 15 minutes this discussion among each other. And I think this is thought-provoking. And finally, we are going to the questions from the audience and also from people online. So, therefore, the first speaker, this is Balkan, please.
Thank you very much. I hope my voice is coming clear. Thanks a lot. And thanks to the organizers, Lato, Riga Conference, and Sigita, for this opportunity. And thanks our partners, Latvian Ministry of Defense, for making this panel possible. It's always great to be back in Riga and talk on these issues. The theme of the panel, talking about the Arctic, but in a particular way, thinking about how Russia and China are increasingly cooperating in the region, is I believe an important subject that is not necessarily being paid sufficient attention to. I will make three sort of comments as opening comments here on what I see as the current state of that particular cooperation, why it is important, and lastly, one of my hobby horses, why we need to think about Arctic-Baltic connection in a much more rigorous way as this decade continues. On the current, so let me start with my initial point. The Russia-China axis, not an alliance, but an alignment across different geographies, have been intensifying in the past 10 to 15 years, and in different domains as well. So it's not only on the security issue, but also on trade, on energy, on technology transfers, on cooperation in international organizations, on shaping the regulatory environment, from internet governance to data to how to engage in infrastructure projects, so on and so forth across the world. Arctic had been one of the exceptions to that particular cooperation. Russia was quite reluctant to let China in a meaningful way to the Arctic, because for several reasons. One is that it's a sovereignty issue, of course, for Russia. It's also a region, a part of the world that it provides about 28% of Russia's GDP because of its resources. It has a significant population, and of course its strategic forces, its nuclear forces, are located in the Arctic. So Russia has been quite reluctant to have China, particularly militarily, be in the region. That changed. After Russia's restart of the war, the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. And if I'm not mistaken, and General could correct me here, earlier this year they had a military exercise in the Arctic for the first time together. Previously, they did have in the Pacific, in the Black Sea, in the Baltics, in the Mediterranean, there were joint military exercises with China and Russia, but not the Arctic. This changed this year, and very recently they did sign a cooperation agreement, a memorandum of understanding between Chinese Coast Guard and the Russian Coast Guard. That also involves the Arctic. Those are, I think, maybe sort of underreported, but very important developments, suggesting that this particular relationship is moving forward, and Russians are changing their view of China's presence in the Arctic. Very, very quick 2 points, and then we can get to the other part. Why this is important? This is important because, as China like to call themselves a near Arctic power, I don't know what that means. In that case, Canada is a near Latin American power. So they are very deliberately developing capabilities to ensure persistent presence in the Arctic. They're building icebreakers. They are developing their new generation submarines to be able to sustainably stay under ice, etc. And they see the Arctic not only as a trade route that goes between Pacific and the Atlantic, but also as a source for natural resources, as a source for fishing, and thus they are making not only commercial plans, but military presence, eventual military presence, to protect those commercial interests. And therefore, they will be focusing on the Arctic quite more. And of course, the alliance, NATO and NATO members like Canada, Arctic is home to us, but also 7 others, well, 6 now, but soon, hopefully 7 other Arctic Council members are NATO members, or will be, with Sweden joining shortly. And it is a central northern flank that we need to think more thoroughly. Last point, on the Arctic-Baltic connection. And I'll be happy to expand on this during the discussion. But it is important to think these theaters, be it the North Atlantic, be it the Canadian Arctic, European High North, or the Baltic, as interconnected areas of operations and political realm. Because one thing, that's how the Russians perceive them at any rate. But the second thing is that as Russia's military capabilities are degraded, the conventional military capabilities are degraded in Ukraine, they will be more and more relying on their strategic forces, on their nuclear forces, which are largely intact and remaining in the Arctic for political pressure and leverage in other areas, including the Baltic Sea. And major Baltic powers are also major Arctic powers. There's Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, and of course Canada is not only an Arctic power, but as I like to say, it's also a Baltic power because of our presence here in EFP. So we have to start thinking much more rigorously about the connections between the Arctic and the Baltic, because things that happen in the Baltics doesn't stay in here. Things that happen in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic as well. So I'm going to shut up now.
Thank you so much. Robbie, can I?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, brilliant. I'm going to have some feedback. Thank you for letting me talk. And I look out and I see a very young audience here, and this is really important for this conversation. Because what we are fundamentally talking about today with the Arctic and with cooperation, if we want to put that word into play at this stage between China and Russia, up there is a result of probably the biggest change for thousands of years that we've ever experienced in civilization. And that is due to climate change. And what we are seeing, and this applies, as I say, so much more for the young audience here than it does for us oldies up here who are talking, hopefully with a bit of wisdom and experience, because it's you guys that are going to have to live with the consequences of what is about to happen up there. So thinking about what is about to happen is arguably one of the most important things that we have to do. And actually, not just about what is about to happen for us to lay this down, but also because it will affect not only you guys, but your children as well, the decisions that we make today. Why is it a problem? Because climate change has effectively changed, is about to change, let's put it that way. The geo-economic laydown of the world, when we open sea lines of communications, largely between the Asia-Pacific and Europe. Let's remember this and hold this in our thoughts. Because Canada and the United States already have Asia-Pacific ports and access. But suddenly the Europeans are going to have a two-way flow in your lifetimes of possibly technology-inspired AI autonomous container shipping, for example, that's going to be going over the top on cleared routes because the icebergs are melting. And when they go over there, we are going to create, on what has previously been, let's make this simple, an Arctic wasteland that was viewed in my generation as something completely different in security terms. We are creating a geo-economic boost for Europe in particular, and the Asia-Pacific, not necessarily for North America, and it's something maybe we can discuss, but a security issue. Why are we creating a security issue when we go over the top of the world? Because as we enter a new world of multipolarity, if you want to call it that, we're entering a world where on one side you have a big coastline of Russia, and on the other side you have the United States and Europe. And you have, with that particular grouping, effectively 4 out of 5 Arctic members who are literal members who border through landmass alone the Arctic. One of them, however, the fifth one is Russia. In the Arctic Council, as and when, I hope, and I'm sure it's going to happen, Sweden joined NATO, 7 out of 8 members of the Arctic Council will be NATO members. And there is another little thing that's creeping into the discussion in Europe in particular, and I'm very interested to discuss hopefully about Denmark's role here because it's fascinating. But something really interesting is happening in that the rhetoric is changing recently. We're now referring a lot in Europe to European Arctic. Well, there's a reason for that. Because from a European perspective, that geo-economic change is going to be massive. When you don't have to sail your ships all the way around the world to get your trade moving, and they can knock weeks and weeks off by going over the top of the world, it makes a huge difference. And where they're autonomous, that also adds an interesting dimension. Because as we know, the Russians are very less or more inclined perhaps to sink something that is driven by a robot than a human being. So there's an interesting technical aspect in your generation to consider there. From a geopolitical side, as I've already touched upon, we're seeing a more multipolar world coming in, and this cooperation between China and Russia potentially creeping in, as we've seen with, as Balkans brilliantly articulated, with not only exercising more frequently, not only memorandums of understanding, but also something really big that happened in February 2021. Something big happened because the Russians took an icebreaker. They teamed up with a fuel ship, if you like, liquid gas ship from China, and they sailed for the first time from China to Russian energy ports in the north, and effectively back again, having filled that Chinese ship up with liquid gas. That was 2 years ago. The Russians since then have been building icebreakers. They have been investing in technology to look underneath the holes, to build those holes so that they're strong enough to deal with when the icebergs melt, the next threat in that harsh region, which is sludge ice. It's not the ice you see, it's the ice you see underneath. How does it get through that? And it is stealing a march on all of us with this sort of basic technology to get through austere lands. An austere sea, but also it is doing this with China, because China's Belt and Road Initiative, as we've seen, is about two things. It is about trade, obviously, and building up that sort of trade, but it's also about energy in particular, and the two are interlinked, and Elizabeth, I'm sure, will cover that too. So this cooperation is naturally starting to occur. There's something else happening as well, and that is the militarization of the Arctic. The Arctic for 30 years was a peace zone. Well, look at what is happening on the moon, or is about to happen on the moon. We're seeing almost a space race taking part in space on the moon. Look at what is happening in space in terms of competitive activity between nations. The Arctic as a peace zone, I would submit to you, is no longer to be contemplated. If we're competing in space, the Arctic hasn't got a chance. So in terms of security terms, and you'd expect me to say this, that militarization, almost Soviet-like by the Russians, building another buffer zone with threats into another dimension, which is deeply worrying and again needs to be touched upon, which is nuclear, is also threats, I say, to detonate a nuclear weapon only 2 weeks ago in the Arctic Circle as a demonstration, as a test. What is that about? These are worrying activities and worrying security activities we need to cover. So quickly to touch on nuclear. I worked as before in the UK Ministry of Defence for the Vice Chief of Defence Staff, and we looked after the nuclear side, and I worked in NATO for the chair of the military committee until recently. The nuclear battlefield, and it's a legacy system, it's an old weapons system, but it is fundamentally our deterrent space, and it will continue and endure. But that system and that piece of ground that we operated the nuclear deterrence over was the Arctic Ocean. So if you understand how nuclear deterrence works, you understand the significance of it. If you take those digital platforms I mentioned, all of those platforms that are going to go in your lifetimes across those sea lines of communication, you have an awful lot of digital platforms interfering with what was the nuclear battlefield. That has an impact on security. Also, of course, let me just quickly remind you, the Russian North Fleet is there to protect the Russian nuclear deterrent on board in the north as well. So there is a nuclear dimension. So what? So my pitch to you is we need to start thinking in security terms. There needs to be a debate between allies about how we break down the security of the High North in the future. Is it NATO-based? Because at the moment, NATO look in the European Arctic region up to the North Pole on a day-to-day basis. America and Canada, through NORAD and the US North Command, look at the other part of that journey from the North Pole to Japan and South Korea. So something needs to happen to tidy up the security architecture in the High North in the future. So what? When it comes to strategic level, it's often better to have simple principles, especially with organizations that are consensus-based. So our strategy at the moment in NATO is for Russia has always been to have a dialogue, and that's not going so well, to deter and have deterrence as part of that dialogue, and to defend. That's the Russian strategy that has endured. We need something for China. And China, we need to consider, is getting close to Russia. I don't think they are in bed together by any means at this stage. I think there's still hope. But for China, perhaps we need a dialogue. Perhaps we need also to continue to deter, but we need to decouple it. Is there a way that perhaps through the trade routes opening up to Europe and the Asia-Pacific, that could be played in? I don't know. But something needs to happen in the conversation at the strategic level and to drive that sort of strategy between the two, I believe. So decoupling, I think, is the future for hopefully a prosperous future for one of the few benefits, dare I say it, of climate change for Europe and the Asia-Pacific in the future.
Thank you you, Robbie.
Sorry, I went on.
Jonathan, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers, and also for allowing two Canadians to be on an Arctic panel. There's no hidden intentions or meanings behind that. So much has been said, and I'll try to be concise and have a few tidy points. The first point, though, is I think just the framing of this panel itself is important. When we're having an Arctic discussion, inherently this is also a transatlantic discussion. This is also an Indo-Pacific discussion. The interconnectivity of the themes, of the importance, I think Balkan and the General have mentioned some of these, whether it's on energy security, whether it's on traditional security, whether it's on alliances, whether it's on critical minerals. There's a thematic interconnectivity. There's also a regional interconnectivity. One of the data points that I'll point to is China, of course, gets a lot of the attention, but some of the Arctic Council observers, including Japan, South Korea, and even Singapore, and many people will look on a map and say, you know, maybe they don't know their geography very well, but they look at Singapore and they say, where is Singapore? And why is Singapore in the Arctic Council? But it makes sense because Singapore is one of the largest global shipping hubs, and what happens potentially with the future of global shipping in the Arctic means a lot, potentially for their bottom line. So I think thinking about this in very broad terms at the onset is important. Let me dive into three quick points. I think the first point is on China in particular. So the idea that China was a benign actor in the Arctic and that it's not something that we should worry about, I think that is a fundamentally flawed point. And it's flawed on multiple levels. So the biggest data point, of course, is through their icebreakers. China now will soon have their third icebreaker, which will be procured in 2025. But I think we're mistaken just to focus on the icebreakers themselves. Their polar institutes and their other maritime institutes, the Coast Guard, et cetera, have capabilities that will be brought to bear in the Arctic, and we need to be looking at that. The second one is it's not just focused on their icebreakers. It's the infrastructure money that they're putting in, the underwater surveillance that they're putting in, and Canadians, I think, will remember this because we unfortunately had to have our American friends shoot down one of these balloons. But the surveillance that we're seeing, the high altitude balloons that the Chinese have shown a willingness to use for intelligence and surveillance purposes is also another tool in their toolkit. So as Balkan mentioned, this near Arctic state that I think the Chinese in their polar white paper have put forward, clearly none of us realize that this is a spurious term that the Chinese have just effectively invented, but it shows their intent. Sometimes I think we overanalyze things, and we should actually look at what sometimes our adversaries are saying. And if you read that white paper, I think the Chinese are quite clear. Yes, it's multifaceted. Yes, it's largely economic at this point in time, but they are bringing capabilities to bear in the Arctic. So I think the idea at the first blush is not to dismiss this, not to dismiss that China is in the same boat as Singapore and Japan and South Korea. No, their capabilities are different, their interests are different, and their intentions are different. The second point I'll make is quickly on the Russia-China partnership. So I think more broadly from a grand strategic scale, and you see this now as we're having these discussions in Riga, the backdrop of Xi Jinping hosting his Belt and Road Initiative 10-year anniversary, Vladimir Putin obviously being feted there as well in Beijing, along with 150 states. The point I'll make is that well before Russia's egregious war in Ukraine, Russia was the junior partner in this relationship. Its stake in the junior partner, if it was a junior partner of a 3 out of 10 scale, now it is about a 1 out of 10. So Russia effectively has become a discount shopping store, convenience store for the Chinese on energy, on many other elements. And that is leaving vulnerabilities in that relationship. I think as Balkan mentioned, the Arctic was one of the theaters, Central Asia and others are ones that traditionally the Russians also have had worry and apprehensions about Chinese engagement. It's one of the theaters that was the no-go zone. Yes, Russia relented and allowed China into the Arctic Council, but there was apprehensions and worries there. I think increasingly as these trends and increasingly as Russia's isolation internationally intensifies, I think we will see that ability of China to push harder in the Arctic. So I think this is a trend that we shouldn't dismiss. The last quick point before passing on to Elizabeth is sort of into the so what. How do we deal with this institutionally? And I think this also is where we need to be a little bit creative. The Arctic Council, which we've talked about a little bit today, but I don't think we've spent enough time, is at a crisis moment right now. Clearly, it's not tenable to have Russia there in part of these discussions with what's going on in Europe. We all understand that. But Russia's suspension from the Arctic Council and China's reaction to that, effectively saying, we don't recognize the Arctic Council and what it says if Russia's not a part of that, that has profound implications for us all. And I think we need to be thinking about that going forward. We need to respond to it. It doesn't mean that we throw out the Arctic Council and say that it's become an irrelevant tool, but some of the things that my co-panelists have mentioned already, whether it's through NATO, whether it's through work with our Baltic friends, whether it's other sort of alignments, we need to be thinking more creatively about the complexity of issues, infrastructure, investment, security, energy security, and thinking of different formulations to really drive that home. So with that being said, I'll pass the floor over to the more experienced Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the organizers for having me here as a panelist. I'd like to focus on something. First of all, 30 years of peace in the Arctic, I don't see it like that. Sorry, I have to say that. The West always considers to have 30 years of peace, but Russia never ever did it. And that's one of the biggest mistakes the West did in that. And for example, in 2007, when the Russian put the flag on the North Pole, somebody laughed, somebody did discuss a bit, and then it was forgotten again. And in history, the Arctic always has been a bit of an experience field for the big power coalition or big power competition. And in that case, this was lost after 1990 as well. But now it came back, and Russia already, one of the first military doctrines in the time under Putin was regarding the Arctic. And they went into those fields where NATO stepped back. And that was very interesting for me to see that nobody reacted to it. There was I think one of the mistakes of the West was that the northern-east part of the NATO flank was just forgotten a bit about it in that case, in that times. And today we have to focus two things. First of all, Russia is more or less, by now, they try to be it not, but they are a bit of a junior partner to China. And we have to see that, for example, the military fleet of China increased ever so much during the last 10 years. I think nobody in the West really realized what it means. I think it's by now nearly as big or even bigger than the British fleet. And that we have to take into account. I think there's no discussion on that, what it means as well for the northern part. And if you see that since 2014, the increase of shipping was tripled in the Northern Sea Road. And 80% have been on gas and oil. And by now we have got a big problem as well regarding that the oil tanks from China are not on the polar codes regarding the security. So we have got old oil tanks. So if we talk about security, it's not only military security, it's not only climate security. And so this is one of those things which we never discussed. And one of the discussion, or one of the points regarding the difference between West and East was, if the West was discussing for a long time, if the West was discussing Arctic security, we were discussing melting ice and what it means for having climate security. In Russia, it was always discussed about military and economic security. That was the biggest difference. And for example, we don't know up to now what will be meant with melting ice regarding the environmental security, because most of the old pipelines in Russia are constructed regarding to have ice around. So if they will break, and we have got the one or the other break already, this will have a totally impact on the environmental security, not only for that part, but as well for the Arctic. So this is one of those things which even will connect us to those things. And we have to see if China is increasing it much more. Russia at the moment is building up another LNG terminal, beside all the sanctions which are there. and without any problems. So we have to discuss the sanctions as well. But we can see that the China-Russian alliance in the Arctic will give an extraordinary impact to all the security parts regarding especially Europe, but as well Canada and the United States. And that's my point now. Please.
The very famous philosopher Mike Tyson said, if you have a plan, the first punch on the mouth will change that plan, So I have to change the plans because we're already half time. But it's fascinating things that we have said, and if I may, there is, for me, a paradox that comes out. On the one hand, a couple of panelists said Russia becomes a junior partner of China. On the other hand, Robbie, you mentioned it, the nuclear aspect and the nuclear. So we see a paradox of a very powerful, but at the same time weak player. Can we elaborate a little bit on this? I mean, can we have a couple of thoughts about this paradox? I mean, Russia.
I think it is a paradox. I think it's a very interesting one, because let's be brutally honest. When you look at from a nuclear perspective, Russia has been modernizing its nuclear forces and is messaging every day to the West to leave us alone in Ukraine and what we're doing, and not to threaten us, because if we have to revert, we will revert to nuclear. That's what they are saying on a daily basis. And we saw this yesterday. We saw this yesterday when, because a lot of the dialogue, as we say, has stopped. That's dangerous. But actually, so it's now messaging and dialogue through strategic communications. And one of the things the Russians did yesterday was make sure that their guy carrying the briefcase for Putin was visible, which is an unusual act for them. Well, that means they're messaging, I believe, not just, as has been reported by most commentators, the West, to continue this constant drumbeat of nuclear messaging and deterrence. But I think they're also messaging China. Because when you do that on Chinese soil, you are saying to the Chinese, we might be a junior partner here, and we might be having a conversation with you as a very, very unequal one, as has just been mentioned. I mean, very unequal. I think you're right. I think 2 to 10 is probably about right. But you are messaging to say, don't forget that an awful lot of our nuclear capability points south as well as north. And if you're China with a smaller force, but again, a modernizing force, rapidly modernizing nuclear force, you're not only messaging that you are going towards potentially able to hit the USA east to west, but north, from south to north as well, but you also have an awful lot of your nuclear deterrent pointing south towards India. So this really is a paradox when you're thinking about a multipolar versus bipolar world, potentially, as things might be creating. So I think there's two parts of that messaging there. But that gives us an advantage, because that allows us, again, going back to my point about decoupling, that gives us a seam with which we can start to work away at. Because if China is being messaged by Russia, don't forget we're an equal partner on nuclear alone, and our military capability, which, let's face it, conventionally is being decimated in Ukraine. That's all Russia has left to really project at the moment.
So we have to play in.
We have to play in
that they are not allies but aligned at this moment.
Yes, that's exactly it. And making statements to each other that they're more equal than they actually are.
If I could just quickly jump in on this. One thing, we shouldn't make a mistake that just because Russia is the junior partner, that China doesn't need Russia in certain ways. I mean, I think you rightly pointed out some of the imbalances on the nuclear side. I actually look at the geography side. So look at the map. China would love some of Russia's geography. So the Chinese strategists often flip the map on the opposite side, and they look at, they're hemmed in everywhere. They have Japan, a U.S. ally. They have Taiwan. They have the Philippines, a U.S. ally. They have very little maritime space. They look at the Russian side and they're like, wow, there's geography there. And this is a slow burner that I think we need to pay a lot of attention to in the coming months, is as this relationship becomes more and more important, as the leverage becomes stronger on the Chinese side, does Russia start potentially having partnerships, potential port investments? One of the worries that I know, for example, our Japanese friends have, the 4 disputed islands, the Kuril Islands, north of Hokkaido, potentially a Chinese partnership, some sort of collaboration with the PLA Navy. These things are not impossible. So yes, junior partnership, but there are things that Russia has that the Chinese needs, energy, of course, being another one, that I think we need to pay attention to.
And I would just quickly add that just what General pointed out. Once you for Russia, it's not even a hammer, but it's a sledgehammer, the nuclear, right? And increasingly, when you start taking other tools from them, and when you only have a sledgehammer, everything looks like concrete that you want to break. And in this particular partnership too, they will increasingly rely on the nuclear component of it. Yes, Chinese are modernizing their nuclear arsenal. They're increasing the numbers because they're concerned about a potential nuclear scenario in the Straits. But they're still far away from what the Russians have, particularly on the tactical level stuff. And Russia would continue to rely on that. And you can add the non-nuclear strategic weapons, like the hypersonics, and so on and so forth, also destabilizing the nuclear theater, which again the Russians are investing in, both underwater capabilities, the Poseidon and other things, but also hypersonics, which again I think would need to think much more thoroughly the increasing use of the nuclear forces and nuclear deterrent by Russia to achieve increasingly smaller and smaller political gains, which will create a tension with China, because Chinese don't really want to get into the nuclear play. You don't want to do that when you're facing with the United States and you have like 400 nuclear weapons. So that's going to be one fissure point.
I'd like to support the position of the General regarding the especially a dialogue with China by itself. Because China itself characterized as an Arctic country because they signed up the Spitsbergen Treaty in 1925, which is very interesting to take this as a reason to be an Arctic country, but it is. And as we can observe as well, there are a lot of scientific arrangements already between some of the Arctic countries and China. So they first of all try to put in the manpower before military and economic power. So it was interesting to see the cooperation between Iceland and China, between Greenland and China, and so on. And so I think that could be a point to step in, to have a special dialogue between China and other countries and Russia. This we should take into account. So,
Maybe you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I was going to come back as well and highlight, just re-emphasize something on your point, but from a slightly different angle. So when you talked about geography, there is something else happening over on the far eastern side of Russia right now with linking to China too. And that is, you're seeing a quite significant increase in Chinese diaspora moving into eastern Russia, around Vladivostok, into Siberia and so on. That can't please the Russians, who are fundamentally a nationalist based system as they are at the moment. That, and will be for many years to come. I think that plays to some of the seams and the frictions between the two that are worth exploiting, perhaps, or noting. And the other point I'd make, back to you, Balkan, is on the nuclear side. Something is happening in Europe, and something is happening in terms of discussions, as I've mentioned, about how do we do this security together with North America, and how do we break it up, and how do we do that? It sort of leads you back continually to NATO, not just because of the reasons I mentioned earlier, that most of the Arctic, almost all the Arctic Council, apart from the challenger Russia, are NATO nations, and will be when Sweden joins. But I think that we're entering a period, going back to my point on deterrence and nuclear deterrence, for 30 years, where it's going to be, sadly, our primary deterrence system. And that's again what the Russians are signaling. So what you're seeing in Europe is more discussion about nuclear shields, nuclear ballistic missile defense, and so on. That can't be done by Europeans alone. That has to be synchronized, it has to be controlled, it has to be led by some sort of organization that takes all of this together for North America's defense as well as Europe's, and contributes together for some sort of defensive type system, again, which will be based around the Arctic because of the geography involved here. So there is some sort of cooperation thing that, in terms of nuclear shields, if you want to call it that in the future, that something like NATO must start to waken up to, perhaps. And I'd just quickly add that NATO has done something in the last 3 years, two major philosophical changes in NATO that many commentators have not noticed. The first one is the Chiefs of Defence recommended, and it was actioned, and it led to the strategic concept to catch up with the military advice, that NATO should not be capability focused for deterrence, but threat focused. That threat was state threats, that was Russia, and China, as Jens Stoltenberg says, is coming to us. That's in every domain, global domains like the information domain, and physically with Russian People's Liberation Army Navy ships in the Mediterranean. Who would have thought? And, of course, Belt and Road initiatives in Italy, which are causing friction in Italy. So you have them coming to us. And I think, so the threat focus is significant. It's a big philosophical change and the right one to concentrate better use of resources. And the second thing is NATO started again to get back into strategic enablers and using them, partly because the Americans were taking theirs to concentrate on the Asia Pacific, and by that, that's intelligence, various other things. But if you look at NATO fielding Global Hawks, for example, from Sigonella, these are big strategic drones for NATO. That means NATO is, for the first time for a very long time, producing its own intelligence. It is not reliant on what the allies feed it, which is sometimes politicized. That's significant. And when you add that to the other strategic enabler and the biggest weapon system, frankly, NATO has, it is called the command and control structure. Because that international command and control structure is in place and has been for many years and is significant. It is rehearsed and it has secure communications to do what it does, right from the strategic level downwards. It's the only international organization that has that sort of capability.
I take a couple of questions that I see here, but I want to bring them into another paradox, actually. Actually, I'm living nearby Antwerp, an important port. So the importance of Western ports, and this comes to the practicalities, is there a paradox between enhancing economic cooperation, the importance of trade and so on, and at the same time, because this was a question, it is about the sanctions. We have a sanctions policy against Russia, and at the same time, it's in our benefit to have trade, and the Arctic discussion is about, among others, trade. Can we develop a couple of ideas about this? I mean, Robbie, perhaps have you some ideas?
So when you're talking about ports, and again we're talking Antwerp, we're talking Rotterdam as the main receivers, really, of the trade coming over the top of the world. Let's leave, and of course the main exporting ports going the other way to the Asia Pacific. Arguably Brexit took away Liverpool's chances of becoming equally as big a port, sadly. But let's see what happens in the future. But there's your reception area. Now, again, going back to my notion about European Arctic, there is a period of time as that shipping, whether it's autonomous or whether it's manned, whatever it may be, but there is a period of time where that will come into those ports that will require protection. So you look at not just NATO security forums as an overarching one, you look at local and regional forums. And one of the ones that I was primarily involved in fact, the last time I was here in Riga, and I have to say this place is looking better and better all the time. I was here putting together the UK Framework Nation Joint Expeditionary Force in 2014. This grouping, from a UK perspective, and the UK Prime Minister, I think, said this in Stockholm last week, essentially, it is about dealing with security threats in our region, not just going global from a UK perspective. But to get to global, you've got to now go over the top of the world, essentially. It's your fastest route to the Asia Pacific in the lifetimes of the youngsters that are here. So there's a layered system for security, and I think when you get these vanguard groupings, in the case of the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a northern nation vanguard grouping, who can cooperate not just in military terms but in technical terms, in terms of buying capability together, financing capability together, interoperability, which helps NATO, and so on. You have quite a powerful way of protecting the entrance into those ports once it starts to get into this European Arctic and down into Rotterdam and into Antwerp.
So meaning that the Arctic developments have a real impact on our lives and our, in our
and our security priorities at a regional level.
Yeah.
Because instead of just looking east towards Russia as a threat, we're now having to look north towards Russia and China as a threat.
On that note, we tried to talk about to Canadians about Russia. One of the things we'd like to highlight is the fact that Russia is not a country far to the east. Russia is our neighbor to the north. And we need to be sort of understanding the challenges that Russia poses as a threat to Canada and Canadian security through that particular lens. And that's why, for example, that the Canadian presence here in the AFP is also about defending Canada, because we are not only defending our allies here, but we are defending Canada as a part of it. So I think we need to sort of understand that. Going back to the questions about the sanctions and trade, and I think I would say that there is a trade-off, and we have been on the commercial side of the trade-off for too long in the West, that we forget that national security requires paying a premium, that it is insurance. And if you don't want to spend pennies today, you will spend hundreds of dollars in the future. Here it is very well understood. In Latvia, in Lithuania, in Estonia, our Polish friends, they understand that if you want to be secure, and if you want to be independent, and if you want to be sovereign, you need to pay that premium, because our adversaries are looking through a geopolitical lens on this. We cannot treat it just business as business. In Canada and in Western Europe, we have been too much about, this is just business and trade. No, increasingly, we need to understand that the trade and commerce and investment brought by Russia and China are tools for geopolitical interests, and we have to be able to pay that particular premium, and we are not doing it. And a sanctions argument is not really about deterring, but it's about degrading their capabilities to be able to push for their geopolitical agendas. And therefore, we're not necessarily trying to deter them, we're trying to degrade their capabilities to harm our interests. So we have to actually speed them up.
The question is, as Elizabeth mentioned, if they really work. I mean, you mentioned a couple of developments in Russia that contradict this sanction, but that's another discussion.
We're making it more costly.
Yeah, very quickly on that point. I mean, I think it's really important to reiterate Balkan's point here so I often make the point that trade agreements, for example, they're not your grandmother or grandfather's trade agreement. The idea, this false bifurcation that I think never really existed, where you had investment and trade on one side and you have national security on the other side, it's a false bifurcation. These are interconnected. So it doesn't mean that we cut states economically out of the map. We can't do that, especially with very large countries like Russia and China. But we have to go in clear-eyed. We have to understand what these risks are. And this is sometimes not always in the form of sanctions, but export controls. For example, we're seeing this a lot with China on sensitive technologies. Why do we put those measures in place? Because for years, the Chinese have effectively been stealing our technology through forced technology transfers, straight out espionage sometimes. So I think we have to put measures in place. The last point on sanctions, I think we have to actually look at the root cause of sanctions. Sometimes sanctions is a last case scenario. It's not that states in Europe or the United States or Canada are happy to place sanctions, especially on large states. It hurts our private sector that wants to engage with these entities. But we do it because of the situations that we've been faced with. When we have flagrant violations of the rule of law, territorial integrity and sovereignty, we have to use these tools. The only other option is effectively kinetic war, which we want to avoid. So it's not that, I agree, it's an imperfect, blunt instrument, but at the same point, when we're forced into this position, we have to look at the cause of it and not only the impact.
Elizabeth?
Just as well to the economic part, I wouldn't say that we pushed them more to the Chinese arms. I think not in economic way. First of all, I would say much more in the military way, because if you see that the drones who are going to Ukraine are mostly coming from China, I think this is one of the other things we can see. But what we have to face as well is that China itself is doing a lot of economic trade with the West, and not just only for the trade, but for military interests. because they're having the harbors, they are going for military strategic infrastructure and so on, and some of the Western countries are ever so stupid, sorry I have to say that, who will take it. And that's one of the biggest problems we have to face for the future, because we will have some of them very important harbors, which are important for NATO as well, who are at least partly now in China's control. So I think this is one of the things we have to look for the future, that we have to stop that.
This is a clear call for realism,
yeah.
So that's very important. We have only 7 minutes, and I wanted the audience to be. Are there any questions from the audience, perhaps? Yes, sir. The mic, yeah.
Okay.
So my name is Gint Jägermanis. I'm with Latvian Institute of International Affairs. I have dozens of questions, but I will ask only one or two. During the discussion, which was fascinating and lots of interesting ideas, the idea of increasing debate, discussion, conversation among Nordic and Baltic and Arctic countries, the joint theater of action. My question would be, what sort of conversation we have seen so far, and what needs to be done to enhance it? And the other question is rather observation. Probably I misread our panelists, but discussing this decoupling, I believe there was a notion that China might be our partner, which I don't see.
Shall we first go for the first question?
Sure. And I'm sure the general has ideas, given his role with the UK MOD on the North Atlantic component as well. But I think when I look at it, I think there is an increasing realization that Nordic-Baltic connection, but also Arctic-Baltic connection, is increasing. But what we really need to do is, at least as someone who's an academic and a think tanker, that we need to bring these communities much more closely and have them talk to each other. And we do have people, working on the Baltics and on Baltic security, having their own thing, and we have, Arctic guys over here doing their own thing and not necessarily talking to each other. Once we start having that conversation, we will be able to see first the connections, but also the differences. Like, as General pointed out, the challenge in the western part of the Arctic, in the Canadian and American one, is different than European High North, than is different than the maritime domain when we look at the North Atlantic. But if we do not talk and try to understand and learn from our own experiences, we won't be getting there. We are slowly getting there. I mean, in the Baltics, there are conversations that started here in Latvia as well. In Estonia, there's increasing interest in the Arctic. In Germany, in the past couple of years, there was an increasing attention to the Arctic. Again, Germany being of course a Baltic power with the position. We have to bring those communities together rather than play in separate rooms in order to improve our own understanding, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I would summarize it by saying that there are two component parts to it. The first one is, if you concentrate, you've got to reconcentrate on the threat. And I think my comments about China and opening dialogue and so on is really about, is there a last-ditch hope to give them a very Sun Suez golden bridge to retreat over and come back into the system? You're probably right. There probably isn't at this stage, but I'm just exploring that. We have to still do dialogue, but I think it's got to be regional groupings based. So from a NATO perspective right now, the Americans have gifted, if you like, the Second Fleet, and it's now a Joint Force Command Norfolk, and NATO are populating it with more NATO people. It's interesting to see which nations are going into it. There's an awful lot of northern nations, because Norfolk is now looking up towards the north. And that's interesting in its own right, but it doesn't cover the bit that I was saying, you know, that US North Command and NORAD, but one of the same, cover, which is the start of that journey from the Asia-Pacific over to the North Pole. So somewhere along the lines, if NATO is the right forum for security, then we've got to have, or we may need to debate whether there needs to be a joint force command for the Arctic. That's a decision that politically needs to be made. That unleashes a really big political discussion from nations about who owns it, who does what, and so on. And that's quite a tricky thing to discuss. So that's the first point. The other point I'd make on regionalism is there are other forums. I mentioned the Joint Expeditionary Force. When we set it up, we opened the door to Canada to join as well. It was set up because it was like-minded nations, it was regionally based, but there's a cultural part of that as well. And the UK and Canada are obviously very close. The door is always open for membership for Canada in that sort of forum, which in military terms can potentially respond faster than even a big NATO decision. To act, because you can anticipate with a group of nations, a vanguard of nations, and maneuver and move faster often in political decision making, and as well you can develop capabilities together. So Canada's interesting, but one little cautious thing to both my Canadian friends is, if you're going to be serious and take threat and regional security seriously, you have to pay. Yes. And Canada at the moment is reneging on the two promises she made, sadly, both of the last two summits, whether in Wales and also, of course, recently in Madrid, to hit 2% GDP. When the Prime Minister makes that statement to Jens Stoltenberg to say we can't quite make it, we're not going to do it, that's not good. Canada needs to think about regional security, and sometimes NATO gets a little bit, it's too broad. Invest in capabilities that will be good for you and you can pay for, and you can make the regional security of the High North better, and you can still get to 2%. So that would be my message to Canada. So please come into these forums, but please get the checkbook out.
Yeah,
very quickly.
Very quickly. So I think I've got about 30 seconds, but full-throated agreement with you, Rob. That could be another panel all in itself. But in not wanting to abuse and jump over the moderator here, but I did want to very quickly. Your question was interesting, but talk on the climate change issue very quickly. I think it's a very important one. If you think of the gold rush in Western North America, when everyone was focused on getting new minerals, the minerals that will be, whether it's energy, whether it's fishing, as you mentioned before, some of this Russia-China partnership that we've been talking about in the Arctic, the litmus test will be when climate change happens. There's going to be some adverse part of that, but there's going to be some opportunity there. And how are Russia and China going to react to that competition that's going to go on for resources there? That's where I'll leave it, and I'll give it to you, Elizabeth.
Just going back to the economic part, I would say we have to find out ways to get a dialogue with China, although I see the threat. But I do know as well that countries who said we are not dealing with it, and the firms over there going to the next country are still dealing with China and doing a business over there. So I think this is not the way we should do it. So otherwise we should make us truly in our dealing with China and all of us, and not only to put it just on a shadow economy in that case. Thank you.
Thank you. This, I think, is a time to close because time is up. But for 30 years, I'm studying Russian affairs. And actually what I took out of this is the paradigm shift. And one of the panelists said, it was always told to us, Russia is in the east and Russia is in the north. And this is a paradigm shift that I take with me. This is tremendous as an idea. And we should think about it very clearly. So the impact of the North and the importance of the North in our security thinking and also in our daily lives, I think this is very important to take with us from this panel. And therefore, I would like, in the name of the audience, also to thank the panelists for their marvelous contribution. And therefore, I would like to close this first session. Thank you so much.
Thank you.